Today, we are witnessing yet another war. Media, diplomats, common public, everybody is talking about Israel-Palestine war. Amidst this war, we are also witnessing the negative use of media for diplomatic gains as well as monetary gains. Before you decide the side you want to join or take a stand on this matter, let's educate ourselves about the history of this long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine. The very beginning of this conflict happened more than 100 years ago. During mid-19th century, the British saw Palestine as an opportunity to create a sphere of influence in the Middle East, where they were competing with the French and Russians. During World War I, when British was fighting the Ottomans who controlled Palestine, they formalized their support for the idea of a Jewish state in the region. On November 2nd, 1917, Britain's then Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild. In it, the British government unilaterally called for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, despite the fact that Jewish people made up less than 15% of the population there at the time. The Allied powers in the war backed the declaration, and after the war, with the help of the newly created League of Nations, a British mandate was created in 1923 and lasted until 1948, which allowed Britain to temporarily rule Palestine until the Jewish state could be created. Before World War II officially began, when the anti-Semitism reached a fever pitch across the continent, particularly in Germany, representatives from 32 countries convened in Evian, France, to discuss resettlement. While many of them expressed sympathy for Jewish refugees, most of them declined to take them in, including the US and Britain. So the British took this opportunity to facilitate mass Jewish immigration. The shifting demography of their nation and the confiscation of their lands by British in order to be given to Jewish settlers worried the Palestinians. Growing tensions eventually led to the Arab Revolt, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. In April 1936, the newly formed Arab National Committee protested against British colonialism and Jewish immigration by withholding tax payments and boycotting Jewish products. The British brutally suppressed the 6 months strike with mass arrest campaign and punitive home demolitions, a practice that Israel continues to implement against Palestinians even today. In the meantime, the British collaborated with the Jewish settler community and formed armed groups and a British-led counter-insurgency force of Jewish fighters named the Special Night Squads. Weapons were secretly imported and weapon factories established in Yishuv to expand the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary that later became the core of the Israeli army. In those 3 years of revolt, 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 to 20,000 were wounded, and 5,600 were imprisoned. The Britain, along with the Jewish settlers, bombed the villages, imposed curfews, demolished homes, and conducted widespread administrative detentions and summary killings. In 1947, the United Nations adopted Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan, which called for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, with the city of Jerusalem to be governed by a special international entity. At that time, the Palestinians owned 94% of historic Palestine and comprised 67% of its population. Thus, the plan to allot 55% to Jewish state, including most of the fertile region, was rejected by the Palestinians. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was created, sparking the First Arab-Israeli War. During the Arab-Israeli War and in the militia attacks that preceded it, more than 7 lakh Palestinians were forced to flee and approximately 15,000 were killed in what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. The war ended in 1949 with Israel's victory, but 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and the territory was divided into three parts: the State of Israel, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Gaza Strip. At least 150,000 Palestinians remained in the newly created State of Israel and lived under a tightly controlled military occupation for almost 20 years before they were eventually granted Israeli citizenship. Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, and in 1950, Jordan began its administrative rule over the West Bank. During the Six-Day War against a coalition of Arab forces, Israel captured the majority of historic Palestine on June 5, 1967, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Syrian Golan Heights, and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. For some Palestinians, this led to a second forced displacement, or Naksa, which means setback in Arabic. In December 1967, the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was formed. Over the next decade, a series of attacks and plane hijackings by leftist groups drew the world's attention to the plight of the Palestinians. Settlement construction began in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. A two-tier system was created with Jewish settlers afforded all the rights and privileges of being Israeli citizens, whereas Palestinians had to live under a military occupation that discriminated against them and barred any form of political or civic expression. In 1987, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip rose up against the Israeli government in what is known as the First Intifada. It also led to the establishment of the Hamas movement, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that engaged in armed resistance against Israeli occupation. The 1993 Oslo First Accords mediated the conflict, setting up a framework for the Palestinians to govern themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, and enabled mutual recognition between the newly established Palestinian Authority and Israel's government. In 1995, Israel built an electronic fence and concrete wall around the Gaza Strip, snapping interactions between the split Palestinian territories. The Second Intifada began on September 28, 2000, with the right-wing Israeli Likud party leader Ariel Sharon's visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, a holy site for Muslims as well as for Jews who know it as the Temple Mount. Sharon was a staunch advocate of Israeli sovereignty, and Palestinians perceived his visit as a provocation because he was accompanied by Israeli police. Clashes between Palestinian protesters and Israeli forces killed 5 Palestinians and injured 200 over 2 days. The incident sparked a widespread armed uprising. During the Intifada, Israel caused unprecedented damage to the Palestinian economy and infrastructure. In response, Israel re-entered Gaza and the West Bank, ending the post-Oslo status quo and constructed a reinforced security barrier. Up until 2006, the Palestinian Authority had been dominated by the secular Fatah party, which recognizes the State of Israel and has sought to negotiate with it after renouncing armed resistance in the 1990s. That changed in the 2006 elections when Hamas won a majority of council seats. A Fatah-Hamas civil war broke out, lasting for months, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Palestinians. Hamas expelled Fatah from the Gaza Strip, and Fatah, the main party of the Palestinian Authority, resumed control of parts of the West Bank. And in June 2007, Israel imposed a land, air, and naval blockade on the Gaza Strip, accusing Hamas of terrorism. Israel has launched 4 protracted military assaults on Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, and in 2021. Thousands of Palestinians have been killed, including many children, and tens of thousands of homes, schools, and office buildings have been destroyed. UN officials later found that the Israeli military committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in the operation, including using white phosphorus in populated areas and intentionally targeting civilians. In 2014, Hamas kidnapped and killed 3 Israeli teens from the West Bank. In response, Israel launched airstrikes, ground operations, and naval blockades in Gaza. Though Israel's stated target was Hamas militants and their infrastructure, thousands of Palestinians were killed in the fighting, which persisted for 7 weeks. Another major outbreak of violence occurred in 2021 after Israel threatened to evict Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, which is a home to holy sites of significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And Israeli police imposed restrictions around the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. After 11 days, the fighting ended with a ceasefire brokered by Egypt and Qatar. But Palestinian frustrations were left unaddressed, and outbreaks of violence between the Israelis and Palestinian militants continued. The October 2023 conflict between Israel and Hamas marks the deadliest conflict in several decades. Israel, backed up by the strong support from the US, is evidently conducting ethnic cleansing. Israel has also cut off electricity and most water supply, and it has stopped imports of food and medicine to the Gaza Strip as part of a total siege in retaliation against Hamas. This proves that Israel is willing to eliminate Hamas at the cost of civilians' lives. Before you tweet that next tweet of yours or share any post related to this war, you need to make sure that you understand the history as well as the gravity of the current situation. If you're still in your echo chambers and filter bubbles, you need to step out of it and speak the reality.